I'm slowly approaching the 2-year mark since I started this podcast. Of course, when thinking about my progress, the first thing that I defaulted to was, okay, 2 years, standard podcast is about an episode per week. I should be approaching episode 104, or at least episode 100. Yet, this is only my 11th episode. And at first, I was a little bit discouraged, but then I started to think of it as I'm 11 episodes further than I was 2 years ago, and that's an accomplishment in and of itself. There are a couple of things that have happened in the last 2 years, career changes, surgery, but I guess the single most important thing, or the single biggest reason why it's taken me so long to update this is, to be honest, I was in a bit of a creative rut. And it took a while for me to admit that to myself and to other people, that I was just feeling stuck creatively. That, you couple that and the fact that I was working a lot harder for other people. I was working my jobs more than I was putting work into my own creative pursuits. And obviously that's not the best way to go about things, at least for me. One of the things that helped me kind of get back into the swing of things was just the encouragement from other people. You know, I would always hear people always asking me like, hey, yo, Kyle, when's the next episode of the pod? When's the next episode? I'll listen to that about such and such. And I would always tell them like, yeah, it's coming next week. You know, I'm sharpening my sword. You know, I'm working on some things. It's coming. And next week turned into next month, turned into next year, et cetera, et cetera. And honestly, that encouragement from those people, even though the number of people started to die down over time, understandably so, that encouragement definitely helped me get back into it, because there were still people who were invested in what I was doing. And that was one of the lessons that I learned. It's just so long as you're willing to put in the work, there's always going to be people who are invested. Now, the amount of work can determine how much or how many people are invested, but that's just always something to think about when it comes to your own personal pursuits. So with all of that being said, I felt like it was kind of timely to have this episode be about exactly that. And what I mean is, I want to take today's episode of Underground Genius to look at some of the reasons why it takes creators so much time in between projects. Whether it's a musician, a novelist, a movie creator, a game producer, or whatever the case may be. There are a bunch of different reasons, and I kind of wanted to go over them today. And the number one most important reason is because they can, and it's really none of our business as the audience. You know, obviously, if you're invested in someone, you want to always see what they're coming out with next. But then at the same time, at least for me anyway, I would like it for any given creator to work at their pace, just so I know that they're putting their best foot forward. But of course, the answers are a little bit more nuanced than that. So reason number one, there's just simply too much work, too much effort that needs to be put into making the art. So there's an author by the name of Marisha Pessl. In 2006, she published her first book, Special Topics in Calamity Physics. And even hearing that the title of that book, one would assume that that's a college textbook or some book that's set in academia. And that's understandably so. It's actually a novel, but she did kind of leverage that collegiate style to create this narrative. And I had never, up until that time, I had never read anything like this, considering how unique the character's voice was. Rather than, you know, making a brainy or a nerdy character, she basically created a narrative style based on that one singular attribute. And each page was just so dense with this style that, I'll be honest, I don't know if the average reader would be able to get through it just because of how dense the pages were. But if you were able to get through it, the payoff was great, in my opinion. The quality of the novel was really good. And after reading one chapter, though, it was obvious that she spent a lot of time researching and developing this unique set of characters and the plot as well. And in 2013, so 7 years later, she published her second book titled Nightfall. Obviously, 7 years in between books isn't necessarily frowned upon in that medium, but like you take it to, let's say, music, for example, that could be a death sentence because the landscape changes vastly in that amount of time. And with the book Nightfall, again, she was doing things that I had never seen in books. She was including screenshots of web pages, and she had this interactive app that accompanied the book, and you would be able to use the app to kind of decode things in the story. It was a thriller novel, so it kind of added value to that story. Again, it wasn't necessary, but it was just something to kind of complement the reading experience. And it wasn't even so much of a reading experience as it was like a multimedia experience, because you had all of these different things. You had text, you had pictures, you had the app, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm certain that it took a long time for her to conceptualize and to fully publish the book. But I'm pretty sure she would be able to better tell you what that experience was like herself. So I'll play a clip from an interview that she did regarding the book Nightfall.
Well, we have this like very obvious, overt celebrity culture, but why can't there be more mystery? And I think in this day and age where there's Facebook and Twitter, where we're living in a world where there seems to be less and less mystery around us. So this book was very much a reaction to that, to create a figure that is well known and quite popular, but is entirely underground. And even though he is popular, people really don't know very much about him. I hadn't actually written a word of Nightfall when I was like coming up with the plots of Cordova's 15 horror films. And all of my friends were like, well, maybe you should actually start writing the actual book and not worrying about like what his like background material is. But I felt like that was so much a core of what the novel comes out of that I really needed to know what that background was. It's a pet peeve of me as a reader when I'm reading a novel and I just don't feel that the author knows like really key things about their characters or the morality of their world, or so I really just wanted to not fake it and just to know it myself and to take the trouble to make it real to myself. But that part of writing is actually like it's probably what I live for, the idea of creating and creating something out of nothing. That's the most gratifying aspect. So if I can spend 2 weeks coming up with these biographies and these characters from scratch, like that is my bliss. A lot of what Cordova...
All right, so like I said, Nightfall was published in 2013, and it shortly after that, it became a New York Times bestseller. And one of the things real quick that in researching this part of the episode, I just thought to myself, like, yo, what does it mean to be a New York Times bestseller? Like, for example, in music, if I was to tell you that an album became number one on the Billboard 100, you would know exactly what that meant. But New York Times bestseller, that's always an award or a stat or an attribute always thrown around, but I'd never necessarily knew exactly what it meant. So I did a little bit of digging in. There are a couple of lists. There's their weekly list, and then there's the monthly list. But more often than not, people refer to their status on a weekly list. And basically the requirements are you need to sell a specific amount of books, of units per week. And if I'm not mistaken, that number is at least 5,000 for your book to be considered on the list. But it can't be 5,000 from the same spot. So I can't publish a book, go to like Barnes and Noble's website and then just buy 5,000, then I'm on the list. No, it has to be from different sellers. And one of the things is just like the Billboard 200, it's ranked. So you have this New York Times. You have number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list, number 7, etc. The list goes on. But we never really talk about the ranking. We only talk about if it is an NYT bestseller or if it isn't. Which is interesting because Obviously, there are a bunch of reasons why you would want to be on that list. You know, you can get brand deals, you can get movie and TV show adaptations if you're on that if you're on that list. But it kind of the way we gauge success in that field, in books and novels, fiction and nonfiction, is different from the way we gauge success in music. You know, a number 1 or a number 2 holds more weight than a number 13 or a number 15. But considering how much music comes out today, how many new albums come out every Friday, I feel like even getting on that top 200 list, or even in the top 20 or the top 30, is an achievement in and of itself. And it would be something like we would look at music a lot differently, and we would look at the success of an album a lot differently if we just started to focus on the achievement of getting on the list as opposed to where you're ranked on the list. That's just a little food for thought. So that's number 1. There's just so much work that needs to be put in order for the creator rather to create that project. So number 2 is the goals and intentions of the creator don't fit the vision of the partners or the handlers or their superiors. And that's pretty straightforward. A case study that I associate with this notion is Lupe Fiasco, Atlantic Records, and his third album, Lasers. So to keep this short, Atlantic wasn't happy with the work that Lupe wanted to put out, and Lupe wasn't happy with the work that Atlantic wanted him to put out. So it kind of seems like you have this stalemate, but in that power structure of artist and label, or label and artist, basically the label has the power in that. So you kind of as an artist, you have to acquiesce to whatever their demands are to some extent. So because of this, Lupe, he kind of checked out during the creative process. And you can kind of hear it. They were feeding him records that didn't really fit his sonic aesthetic. Like, stylistically speaking, a lot of these records, when you compare it to his catalog before and after Lasers, it just doesn't fit. And you can hear it there. These like weird, like bubblegum pop records, these weird collaborations with artists that I'd never necessarily heard him collaborating with. Not to kind of put him in a box, but as an artist, as a music artist, you kind of understand who you can collaborate with, and even if you were to go outside of that box, what those collaborations may or may not sound like. So the messed up thing about these record contracts is, even if your album was done, because he had finished a project before the version that we heard had released, he had already finished a project and Atlantic wasn't happy with it. But the messed up thing is, even if you finish your project, you're kind of at the mercy of your label. You have to satisfy them. They have to make sure that they're able to profit on whatever body of work you come up with. And if they feel like they can't, then you have to basically go back to the studio until you come up with it. So yeah, you can't release an album whenever you want. And this is especially so if you're on the final album of your deal. Because let's say if you try to mail it in, you just try to record whatever, or just so you can finish your contract and get off the label, what the label will possibly do is they'll try to devalue you so that you're not an attractive signee to other labels, and making it near impossible for you to get signed somewhere else. And you as the artist, if you still want to get your message out there, if you still want to record, then what you would do is you would just try and go wherever would sign you. And of course, that label who already signed you and already devalued you would try to re-sign you, because at that point they're the only ones left who are still looking to get your voice out there. And they'll do so. They'll try to sign you on pennies on a dollar. And it's messed up, but unfortunately, that's the business. Now, as for Lupe's personal feelings on the matter, he had this to say in a Complex interview. Quote, "I don't like the process behind Lasers. The music is dope, but I just don't like the process. We were literally at the point where all this music was done except for a couple songs that we did after the protest. So the bulk of the album was done, and we were talking about shelving the album and going to another label. That's where we were like, if you put the record out, put it out. Either move on to the album, either move on to another album or can it, and we'll do other records at another label. The business of it got solved, and I'm happy for the fans. This is their album. This is the album they fought for, and that's what made me do songs like Words I Never Said and All Black Everything. So that's basically number 2. The goals and intentions of the creator don't fit that of their superiors and their creative partners. Number 3, the art was interrupted by a leak forcing change. In music, we see this all the time, sometimes on TV shows too. But in music, you think of artists like Drake, Kanye West, Playboi Carti, Lil Uzi Vert, the list goes on and on. Fans just have an interesting relationship with leaks. Some people even consider the unreleased portion of any given artist's catalog to be their best works. And I don't know if this has to do with some sort of mysticism or an element of us as fans getting this unauthorized access to their deep cuts. I don't know exactly what it is, but just people just love leaks and they latch on to leaks more than the commercial releases. I don't know. For me, it's kind of hard when talking about leaks because I love being able to consume as much music as I can. I want to listen to, especially my favorite artists. If a song is out, I definitely want to listen to it. But then I'm also a firm believer of respecting the creative process and listening and encountering the music the way that the artist intended for me to do so. I can definitely see how a leak can be discouraging to an artist. And what happens, I talked about this in an earlier episode, when we start to create this massive fandom of leaks, it creates this kind of leak culture to where people will be incentivized, people in that artist camp or in that creator's camp will be incentivized to release whatever the body of work is without the creator's consent or unbeknownst to the creator. And like I said, I latch onto this idea of just experiencing the art the way the artist intended. So quick story, when I was in college, I encountered this coffee shop or it was a bakery, I don't know. They serve coffee there. And they had this one item on their menu that was so exclusive, there was no takeaway option. Their justification was you have to the best way to enjoy this drink is to drink it at this specific temperature in this specific cup within this many minutes of ordering and receiving the beverage. Like, I don't drink coffee, so I wasn't missing out, but I always found that to be interesting because maybe there's something that they understood about the flavor profiles and all that other nonsense that me as the buying public, maybe I didn't understand. But one last thing that I'll say on just how the artist envisions their art to be consumed is I think a lot about how last year Z and Beyonce, they unveiled this never before seen Basquiat painting in a collaboration with Tiffany & Co. I personally wasn't the biggest fan of the move, and I'll say this. I believe in the fact that once a piece of art has been made public by the artist, that said artist is no longer the sole proprietor of that piece of art nor its narrative. And I say that to say that anybody can use that. They can leverage that piece of art, whether it's a painting, whether it's an album. They can leverage that to create whatever narrative they want to. At the same time, I also don't believe that anybody or everybody can leverage that art for their own capital gain. Especially in this case, considering the fact that Basquiat's genius wasn't even fully recognized until after his untimely passing. And I'm not saying that that's what Jay-Z and Beyonce did. They just used his name and likeness to make a profit or whatever the case may be. But there are some entities out here that still do that to this very day, which is why Prince was so overprotective of his own brand, of his own likeness, which is why the Marvin Gaye estate is also the same way. They want to make sure that their legacies, their respective estates want to make sure that their legacies are preserved and protected at all costs, and only used in the best way, shape, or form. Going back to this Basquiat thing, though, in an interview with the Daily Beast, a woman by the name of Alexis Adler, she used to live with Basquiat in the late 70s, early 80s. She said that, these are her words, that Jean-Michel, he wouldn't stand for the commodification and the commercialization of his art. She also added, quote, "Unfortunately, the museums came to John's art late, so most of his art is in private hands, and people don't get to see that art except for the shows. Why show it as a prop to an ad?" So that's number 3. Basically, leaks force the artist to change their art, modify it to however they see fit, or they just never release it. Number 4 is the artist is not ready to put out his or her music or art or whatever it is that they're working on. And that's pretty self-explanatory. But to further illustrate this idea, I'll play a clip from a Rick Rubin interview that he did on his podcast, Broken Record. And this kind of sums up this idea pretty nicely.
I haven't been making much music, man. My focus is not there. My confidence is not there. I tinker a lot. Mm-hmm. Like I'll just go to a piano and I'll set my iPhone down and just record what I'm doing, mm-hmm. move my fingers around and whatever happens. But I hadn't been motivated to do a serious project. I'd like to, but it's just not coming. In my own self, I'm trying to figure out where do I sit? You know, I don't even know what I am, and maybe I'm nothing. Maybe I'm not supposed to be anything. Maybe my history is kind of handicapping in a way. Yeah, and so I'm just trying to find out what makes me feel the best right now. Yes, and what makes me feel the best is when I just do these random kind of instrumental kind of things. You know, they make me feel the most rebellious. Yes. You know, I don't know. I have a really rebellious spirit. I don't like to go with the flow, really. I don't know why. Yes. But I just feel best when I don't. Yes. You know, so I have to honor that. I completely understand. I have to honor that in a way, you know.
Oh, for sure.
It's interesting to hear those words come from Andre 3000, considering the fact that every time he's featured on someone else's song, he has a guest verse on someone else's album. It always becomes this big moment, not only in hip hop, but just in music. I'm thinking of the last time this happened. I think this was last year or the year before, whenever Donda came out and he was featured on Life of the Party. I don't know if it was Donda Part 1 or Part 2. I don't remember, but I just find that interesting that he still feels that way, even though the public reception to his music is always super positive. But, you know, can't tell a man how to feel. So that's number 4. Artist is just not ready to put out their work. Number 5, the creator just needs to experience life in order for them to create their next installment. Now, there's some things that can only be conceived and created by expanding your worldview, no matter how old you are or how experienced you are. That's always going to be true. Now, when talking about Good Kid, Mad City, for example, Kendrick Lamar said the overarching narrative on that album was derived from just one single day in his life. Now, of course, the way the album was shaped and the way he told that story on that album was also influenced by his other experiences and things that happened in his life, but that single day was profound enough to bestow upon him the creative inspiration to conceive and deliver that body of work that's now considered a classic today. In between Good Kid, Mad City and his newest project, there are 3 other albums and 3,490 days. And it's obvious that he isn't the same person that he was during his major label debut. And it was necessary for him to experience life, to go through certain things, to lose certain people, and to experience it in a way that only he can, for him to come up with Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. I have a take on that specific album. This episode isn't the time nor the place to give that take, but at some point, I definitely want to talk about that. So that's number 5. The creator just has to experience life in order for them to come up with their next installment. And lastly, number 6, the artist, the creator is entirely too meticulous for their own good. And this is basically something that I suffer from. It's pretty straightforward. You know, I always want to make sure that what I'm putting out is perfect. It's super duper perfect. But let's talk about the why for a second. I'm highly critical of myself, as most creators are. I'm more critical of myself than I am of others. And there's this certain, in any given medium, in any given genre, in any given platform, there's this certain level of quality that I expect from people. And my thinking is, whenever I'm creating or operating in that realm, I have to exceed and shatter that barrier. I have to exceed that expectation. And through this thinking, there's just little to no room to fail, because I want to make sure that whatever I'm producing is perfect. But obviously, as we know, there's no such thing as perfect. The human hand is incapable of producing anything that's perfect, no matter how hard we try. And that's all right. And upon realizing this and fully appreciating that fact, that's when I started to tell myself, like, all right, yeah, it's about that time for you to start making things again, to start producing again. The best part of doing this podcast wasn't necessarily seeing the numbers grow. Although admittedly, that's definitely been a very good part. Subscribe to the YouTube, by the way. Shout out to y'all. Shout out to subscribers. But yeah, that wasn't the best part. It was basically putting together something from scratch. Taking ownership of the process, learning and failing and trying things, experimenting, doing all that. That's definitely been the most fulfilling part of this entire process. And the just seeing me put the product out there, it was just proof that I was doing something. The numbers were proof that I was doing it right to an extent. And as I see these numbers grow, I know what to focus on. I know where I can improve, and I know exactly what's already good that I can just continue to sharpen, et cetera, et cetera. And this kind of idea of perfection, that's the reason why I never went anywhere in music. Now, I talked about this in a previous episode. I became the almost rapper. You know, I was almost done with my project. I was almost ready to release it, almost ready to have a listening party. I was even almost ready to let you listen to just one of my songs. That's just who I was. So, as a creator, how do you combat this? I personally can't speak on what works for everyone. I just know what works for me. And what worked for me is this. As a matter of fact, I'll play another clip from that same Andre 3000 interview, which kind of sums it up nicely.
I think so much of it isn't to be decided.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm saying? It's not, I don't think it's to be figured out. I think it's more to be, I think you start making a lot of things with no thinking of what it's supposed to be or who's it for or what anyone else is going to think, but just get in the habit of making a lot.
That's what I got to get back to.
Yeah, just make a lot. And then at some point in that process, you'd be like, I really like this. It did. And you didn't know, like through that whole process, you don't know when that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's not a decision you make, and it's not an intellectual idea where I have a vision and I'm going to make this thing. It doesn't happen like that. Rarely happens like that. It happens more just having fun, making things. No stakes. There's nothing's on the line.
But see, that's I'm glad you say that's hard to do when everything is actually, when the problem with being an artist, a successful artist,
yes,
is you have to find a comfortable place to do that again.
I'm hoping that you as the listener, after listening to this, can use this as motivation to get started or keep going. Sometimes simply starting your project or your goal is the best thing to do in terms of being productive. I wanted to wait until everything was super perfect, and I waited too long. And I realized that, a month had passed, 6 months had passed, a year had passed, etc. And I realized that there's always going to be stuff that needs work, and that's all right. Even the best movie that you've seen, the best song that you've heard, or just the best thing that you've seen, there's always, if you were to ask the creator, I'm pretty sure they would tell you that there's always something that they wanted to sharpen or perfect that they didn't have the time to do so, or they couldn't find the opportunity to do so. No matter how perfect you might think it is, when talking to the creator, it might be something different. But I will tell you that striving for perfection can definitely allow you to get your best results. But getting back into the swing of things is the only way to get and keep that momentum, in my humble opinion. And that's pretty much all I got for today. If you made it this far, shout out to you. Definitely appreciate the listen. Like I said, subscribe to the YouTube. Definitely working on some things there. But until next time, my name is Kyle S. This has been Underground Genius. Peace.